Picture this scenario. You're checking your investment account at the end of another month, expecting to see the usual modest gains, maybe a few $100s if you're lucky, but instead your eyes go wide because somehow your account jumped by $3,000. Not from contributions, not from some lucky stock pick, just from your existing money quietly doing what money does when you finally give it enough space to breathe. You refresh the page thinking it's a mistake, but the numbers don't lie. Your money made more money this month than you used to make in an entire paycheck at your first job. Welcome to the world beyond $100,000, a place where compound interest stops being a cute concept you read about in finance books and becomes a legitimate income source that works while you sleep. My name is Keith, and I've spent more time than any rational person should thinking about money, wealth psychology, and the invisible thresholds that separate those who build generational wealth from those who spend their entire lives feeling financially stuck. If you've ever wondered what it actually feels like when your net worth crosses into six-figure territory and why this particular milestone seems to unlock a completely different financial game, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if it helps you understand something you've been curious about. Now, most people think crossing $100,000 in net worth is just about reaching a nice round number. It's psychological, they say, a mental milestone that makes you feel wealthy but doesn't actually change anything meaningful about your financial situation. Here's where this conventional wisdom completely misses the mark. $100,000 isn't just a psychological milestone, it's the point where mathematics starts working in your favor instead of against you. Think about it this way. When you have $1,000 invested earning 8% annually, you make $80 a year from your investments. That's nice, but it's not exactly life-changing. It's coffee money. When you have $10,000 working at the same rate, you're looking at $800 annually. Better, but still not enough to get excited about. But here's where things get interesting, and this is something that will fundamentally change how you think about building wealth. When you hit $100,000 earning that same 8%, you're suddenly generating $8,000 annually from investments alone. That's not coffee money anymore. That's real money that can cover a vacation, a major home repair, or several months of living expenses. You've crossed into territory where your money starts generating amounts that actually matter in your day-to-day life. Before we go any further, let's talk about what actually happens inside your brain when you see that six-figure balance for the first time, because there's a neurological shift that occurs that most people never expect. When you've spent your entire adult life seeing 4- or 5-figure balances in your accounts, that first glimpse of $100,000 triggers something psychologists call the wealth threshold effect. Your brain literally processes this number differently than it processes smaller amounts. It's like the difference between looking at a puddle and looking at a lake. They're both water, but your brain categorizes them as completely different things. This psychological shift affects every financial decision you make going forward. Suddenly, you're not thinking about whether you can afford something. You're thinking about whether it's worth buying. The mental framework changes from scarcity to abundance, from surviving to optimizing. This isn't about becoming reckless with money. If anything, people with substantial savings tend to be more careful with their spending because they understand the power of compound interest. But it does mean you start approaching financial decisions from a position of strength rather than desperation. Here's something that might surprise you about the psychology of wealth building. Most people assume that getting to $100,000 is the hardest part. They imagine it's like climbing Mount Everest, where the summit represents the most difficult challenge you'll face. But here's what's actually true, and this might be the most encouraging thing you hear all week. Getting from 0 to 100,000 is exponentially harder than getting from 100,000 to 200,000. And getting from 200,000 to 400,000 is easier still. This seems impossible at first glance, but the mathematics are undeniable. Let's say you're saving $2,000 per month and earning an 8% annual return on your investments. Starting from 0, it takes you roughly 4 years to accumulate your first $100,000. That's 48 months of discipline, sacrifice, and delayed gratification. Every month feels like a grind because you're making all the effort while compound interest is barely contributing to your progress. But here's where the magic happens. Your second 100,000 doesn't take another 4 years. It takes about 2.5 years. Why? Because now you have $100,000 working alongside your monthly contributions, generating returns that accelerate your progress. By the time you're approaching 300,000, each additional 100,000 milestone takes less and less time to achieve. I know someone who tracked this phenomenon meticulously. She told me that earning her first 100,000 felt like pushing a boulder uphill in quicksand. Every month was a struggle, and progress felt painfully slow. But once she crossed that threshold, something shifted. Her money started making meaningful contributions to her wealth building, and what once felt impossible became inevitable. She described it as the moment when compound interest transformed from a concept in a textbook to an employee who never takes a day off. Now let's address something that financial advisors don't often talk about openly, but it's probably the most important factor in long-term wealth building. There's a specific psychological phenomenon that happens around the $100,000 mark that determines whether someone becomes genuinely wealthy or just temporarily affluent. You might think the biggest risk at this level is market volatility or making poor investment choices. Those things matter, but they're not the primary threat to wealth building at this stage. The real danger is lifestyle inflation disguised as deserving rewards. Here's what typically happens. Someone works incredibly hard to save their first $100,000. They've made sacrifices, lived below their means, and delayed gratification for years. When they finally hit that milestone, a little voice in their head whispers that they've earned the right to enjoy some of that wealth. This is where most people sabotage their financial future without realizing it. They start thinking that $100,000 makes them wealthy, when in reality, it just makes them financially stable. They upgrade their car, move to a nicer apartment, or start dining out more frequently. These lifestyle improvements feel modest and well-deserved, but they have devastating long-term consequences. What they don't realize is that $100,000 isn't their reward for years of sacrifice. It's the seed that grows into actual wealth if they can resist the urge to spend it on lifestyle upgrades. The difference between someone who builds generational wealth and someone who just has a nice savings account often comes down to what they do in the months immediately after reaching six figures. Here's something that will completely change how you think about risk and opportunity. Most people assume that having more money makes you more conservative with investment decisions. They imagine that wealthy people play it safe because they have more to lose. The opposite is actually true, and understanding this principle is crucial for anyone serious about building wealth. When you have a substantial financial foundation, you can afford to take calculated risks that people without savings simply cannot consider. This doesn't mean becoming reckless or gambling with your money. It means having the luxury of thinking long-term instead of constantly worrying about short-term volatility. Consider two different investors. The first has $5,000 saved and the second has $100,000 saved. The stock market drops 20%, which happens periodically. For the first investor, this represents a loss of $1,000, which feels devastating when your total savings is only $5,000. They're likely to panic, sell their investments, and swear off the stock market forever. The person with $100,000 experiences the same 20% drop, but they lose $20,000. In absolute terms, their loss is much larger, but psychologically, it feels manageable because they still have $80,000 working for them. More importantly, they have the financial stability to ride out the downturn and potentially benefit from the recovery. This ability to think long-term in the face of short-term volatility is one of the primary advantages of having substantial savings. It allows you to make investment decisions based on logic rather than emotion, which is the key to building real wealth over time. Let me share a story that perfectly illustrates this principle. I know a guy who spent his 20s saving aggressively while his friends were buying new cars and taking expensive vacations. When he finally hit $100,000 in savings, the 2008 financial crisis hit, and his portfolio dropped by 30% overnight. Instead of panicking, he recognized this as an opportunity and invested even more aggressively while stocks were on sale. His friends, who had no savings and were living paycheck to paycheck, couldn't take advantage of the opportunity even though they could see it was a great time to invest. By 2012, when the market had recovered, his portfolio had grown to over $300,000. The crisis that devastated so many people actually accelerated his wealth building because he had the financial foundation to think strategically instead of just survive. There's something fascinating that happens to your relationship with money once you cross six figures that most people never anticipate. You might expect that having more money makes you think about money more often, but the opposite actually occurs. When you're living paycheck to paycheck, money dominates your mental bandwidth constantly. You're calculating whether you can afford groceries, stressing about upcoming bills, and mentally tracking every purchase throughout the day. It's exhausting and prevents you from focusing on more important things like career growth, relationships, or personal development. But when you have a solid financial foundation, money becomes background noise instead of the primary focus of your daily thoughts. This mental shift creates a positive feedback loop that accelerates wealth building in unexpected ways. When you're not constantly worried about money, you make better decisions in all areas of your life. You sleep better, which improves your performance at work. You're more creative and willing to take career risks because you have a safety net. You're more confident in negotiations because you're not desperate. You're more generous with others because you're operating from abundance rather than scarcity. All of these factors contribute to increased earning potential and accelerated wealth building. Ironically, Caring less about money on a daily basis often leads to accumulating more money over time. I remember talking to someone who described this shift perfectly. She said that before reaching six figures, she checked her bank account multiple times per day, constantly calculating and recalculating her financial situation. After crossing $100,000, she realized she hadn't checked her investment accounts in over a month. Not because she stopped caring about her financial progress, but because she finally had enough confidence in her financial stability to focus on other aspects of her life that could contribute to her long-term success. Let's talk about something that might sound counterintuitive but is absolutely crucial for building serious wealth. The most successful investors I know became less interested in investment strategies and more interested in investment psychology once they crossed six figures. When you're starting out with small amounts of money, it's tempting to search for the perfect investment strategy that will maximize your returns. You research individual stocks, try to time the market, and constantly adjust your portfolio based on the latest financial news or investment trends. This approach might generate slightly higher returns in the short term, but it often leads to costly mistakes that destroy wealth over time. Once you have a substantial amount invested, you realize that investment success isn't about finding the perfect stock or timing the market perfectly. It's about avoiding major psychological mistakes and staying invested through all market conditions. The person with $100,000 invested in a simple index fund who never touches it will almost certainly outperform someone constantly trading and trying to optimize their smaller portfolio. This counterintuitive reality is why many wealthy people use surprisingly simple investment strategies. They understand that time in the market beats timing the market, and their focus shifts from optimization to consistency. Warren Buffett has famously said that his best investment advice for most people is to buy a low-cost index fund and never sell it. This advice sounds almost boring when you're starting out and want to actively manage your way to wealth. But once you've experienced the power of compound interest working on substantial amounts, you realize that boring often equals wealthy. The most exciting investment story usually ends with someone explaining how they lost everything trying to get rich quick. Here's the final insight that ties everything together, and it's something that completely changed my perspective on wealth building. Most people think the goal of accumulating money is to eventually spend it on things that will make them happy. Better cars, bigger houses, luxury vacations, expensive gadgets. But here's what actually happens when you build substantial wealth, and this might be the most important thing I share with you today. The real value of money isn't in what it allows you to buy, it's in what it allows you to choose. When you have $100,000 or more in savings and investments, you're not just building wealth, you're building options. Options to leave jobs that make you miserable. Options to take calculated risks on business opportunities. Options to support causes you care about. Options to help family members in emergencies. Options to retire earlier than you ever imagined possible. This realization completely transforms your relationship with money and spending. Instead of viewing your savings as money you're not enjoying today, you start seeing it as future freedom you're purchasing. That expensive car payment isn't just money spent on transportation, it's freedom you're trading away. That luxury vacation isn't just a fun experience, it's months of financial independence you're sacrificing. This doesn't mean you should never enjoy your money or that all spending is bad. It means you become incredibly intentional about where your money goes because you understand what you're actually trading when you spend it. I think about this every time I'm tempted to make a major purchase. I don't ask myself whether I can afford it. I ask myself whether owning this thing is more valuable than the freedom that money could provide if invested instead. Sometimes the answer is yes, and I buy whatever it is without guilt. But more often than not, the answer is no, and I find myself choosing future options over immediate gratification. Now let's get practical about what crossing six figures actually means for your day-to-day financial decisions, because this is where the rubber meets the road. When you have $100,000 in investments generating $8,000 annually, you've essentially created a part-time income stream that requires 0 hours of your time. Think about that for a moment. You're earning roughly $667 per month from money that just sits there and compounds. For many people, that's enough to cover their car payment, their phone bill, and their grocery budget. You've automated a significant portion of your basic expenses through investment income alone. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something most financial advice completely misses. Having investment income that covers your basic expenses doesn't just improve your financial situation. It fundamentally changes your relationship with your career and your time. When you know your essential needs are covered by passive income, every dollar you earn from working becomes surplus that can be used for wealth building or lifestyle enhancement. This creates an incredibly powerful psychological shift where work becomes a choice rather than a necessity. I know someone who described this perfectly. He said that hitting six figures in savings felt like being handed the keys to a completely different life. Not because he suddenly had enough money to quit his job and travel the world, but because he finally had enough financial stability to make career decisions based on personal fulfillment rather than just financial desperation. He could afford to be selective about opportunities, to negotiate from a position of strength, and to take risks that could accelerate his earning potential. Within 2 years of crossing six figures, he had doubled his salary by making strategic career moves that he never would have considered when he was living paycheck to paycheck. The compound effect extends beyond just investment returns and career opportunities. Having substantial savings affects every aspect of your financial life in ways you probably haven't considered. Your credit score improves because you're no longer stressed about making payments on time. Your insurance costs decrease because you can afford higher deductibles. Your investment costs drop because you qualify for lower fee accounts and better investment options. Even your everyday expenses tend to decrease because you can afford to buy quality items that last longer rather than constantly replacing cheap alternatives. Let's talk about the social dynamics of wealth building, because this is something nobody prepared me for when I started accumulating substantial savings. Money changes how other people perceive you and interact with you, often in subtle ways you don't notice until they've been happening for a while. When you're broke, people treat you like someone who needs help or advice. When you're wealthy, people treat you like someone who might be able to help them. This shift can be uncomfortable at first, especially if you don't feel wealthy despite having six figures saved. Family dynamics can become particularly complex once you cross certain wealth thresholds. Relatives who never asked your opinion about anything suddenly want financial advice. Friends might make comments about your spending habits or assume you can afford to pick up the check every time you go out together. Some people will expect you to be more generous with loans or gifts, while others might become resentful of your financial success. Learning to navigate these social changes is an important part of wealth building that nobody talks about in investment guides. But perhaps the most significant change is how you start thinking about time and money differently. When you're struggling financially, time feels infinite and money feels scarce. You'll spend hours researching ways to save $50 on a purchase because your time feels less valuable than the money you might save. Once you have substantial savings and investment income, this equation flips completely. Money becomes more abundant while time becomes the scarce resource you need to protect. You stop spending Saturday mornings clipping coupons and start paying for services that give you time back to focus on things that matter more. This shift in thinking extends to major life decisions in ways that might surprise you. People with substantial savings often choose smaller homes in better locations rather than larger homes in mediocre areas. They buy reliable used cars instead of impressive new ones. They invest in experiences and relationships rather than accumulating possessions. These choices might look like downsizing to people who don't understand wealth psychology, but they actually represent a sophisticated understanding of what money can and cannot provide. The mathematical reality of crossing six figures creates a momentum that becomes almost impossible to stop once you experience it. Remember, at 8% annual returns, your $100,000 becomes roughly $108,000 after year 1. In year 2, you're earning returns not just on your original $100,000, but also on that extra $8,000, plus any additional contributions you make. The numbers start compounding in ways that feel almost magical if you've never experienced it before. By year 5, assuming you continue adding $2,000 monthly and earning 8% annually, your investment account will be approaching $200,000. Your annual investment income will exceed $15,000, which means your money is generating more income each year than many people save in total. By year 10, you're looking at over $400,000 generating more than $30,000 annually in passive income. At that point, your investments are earning more each year than the median American household income, and you still have decades of earning and saving ahead of you. But here's what's really extraordinary about this progression, and it's something that will change how you think about retirement planning forever. Once your investment income exceeds your living expenses, you've achieved what financial experts call functional retirement. You could stop working entirely and maintain your current lifestyle indefinitely through investment income alone. For most people living reasonable lifestyles, this happens somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million in savings, which sounds like an enormous amount until you understand how compound interest accelerates wealth building in the later stages. The beautiful thing about reaching this level of financial independence is that you probably won't want to stop working entirely. When work becomes a choice rather than a necessity, it becomes much more enjoyable and fulfilling. You can pursue projects you're passionate about without worrying about whether they pay enough to cover your bills. You can take risks on entrepreneurial ventures because failure won't threaten your financial security. You can be generous with your time and money because you're operating from abundance rather than scarcity. This transformation from financial stress to financial freedom doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen automatically just because you reach certain dollar amounts. It requires a fundamental shift in how you think about money, spending, and life priorities. The people who successfully build substantial wealth understand that money is a tool for creating options rather than a scorecard for determining self-worth. They view their savings and investments as seeds they're planting for future harvest rather than money they're depriving themselves of enjoying today. The compound effect of building wealth goes far beyond just accumulating money in investment accounts. It affects your health because you're not constantly stressed about financial security. It improves your relationships because you can be generous with others and make decisions based on what's best for everyone involved rather than just what you can afford. It enhances your creativity and productivity because your mental bandwidth isn't consumed by financial worries. Most importantly, it gives you the freedom to design a life that aligns with your values rather than just accepting whatever circumstances you can afford. So when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and thinking about your financial future, remember that crossing 6 figures isn't just about reaching a nice round number. It's about fundamentally changing the trajectory of your life and unlocking possibilities you probably haven't even considered yet. The person you become while building that first $100,000 is infinitely more valuable than the money itself, because that person has the knowledge, discipline, and mindset needed to build genuine generational wealth. Start building that foundation today, stay consistent with your efforts, and trust that the mathematics of compound interest will reward your patience in ways you cannot imagine.